Pretty much everybody, when they start thinking about their own retirement, starts to second guess whether they truly have enough money saved up to quit their day job. And it's understandable. It's a treacherous transition. You go from one phase of your life where you're adding to your net worth, you're in control of your income and your career to some degree. You have income coming in from work, you use that to pay taxes and all your expenses, and then hopefully you have a little bit left over at the end of the month. And that little bit, whether it sits in a bank account or gets deferred into a 401k or a retirement account or something of the like, adds to the pile, adds to the net worth every single pay cycle for the most part. Then you hit retirement and you're just kind of crossing your fingers that the size of the nest egg is big enough to last you for the rest of your life. And it's natural to second guess and really question that because it's kind of scary. You're working with a lot of unknowns over potentially a long term, multi decade period of time. You don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know what inflation is going to look like. You don't know whether you'll need to come out of pocket for long term care help, right? There's a whole lot of variables involved and a whole lot of uncertainty. So, in this video, we're going to cover what it actually looks like in a hypothetical case study to retire with $5 million. It doesn't matter how large your portfolio is. This is a situation we run across in our financial planning firm all the time, but it's pretty similar to everybody who's ever stepped into into retirement since the beginning of time. So here's the situation. We'll create a hypothetical client profile here to work with just to give everybody a look under the hood of what this actually looks like to retire with $5 million. So today's hypothetical client is going to be Joe and Mary Smith. Joe and Mary are 65 years old. They've been working in stable careers for a while. And now they're about to transition into retirement. So of their $5 million portfolio, let's say that $3 million of it is saved in tax-deferred company 401k plans. That's not a stretch. That's very common because that's typically what we see these days. The government wants us to save for retirement, so they afford us all these great tax benefits by using tax advantaged retirement accounts like 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs, and the like. So they've got $5 million in assets. 3 million of it is parked in the company 401k. 500,000 of it is parked in their respective Roth IRAs. And let's say they have 1.5 million in a taxable account, maybe in the name of their revocable family trust. On top of that, let's say that Joe and Mary own a home. It's worth $1.5 million. They've been there for a while. They plan to continue to live there indefinitely. They have a mortgage against the house with a balance of $350,000 at a 4% interest rate, and their payment is a little less than $2,500 a month. Now, let's also say that they have some cash savings that's not really considered part of the portfolio. They have $100,000 in cash in the bank, and they have ordinary spending needs of $20,000 per month, which includes that mortgage payment that I mentioned just a moment ago. One thing that people really like to jump to, given a fact pattern like this or a situation like this, would be the 4% rule. The 4% retirement spending rule has been around for about 30 years, and it's a really helpful kind of rule of thumb. The problem with it is that it's not practical at all when you're actually transitioning into retirement. So a little background about the 4% rule. There was a financial planner named Bill Bengen back in 1993 that wrote a paper commenting on the maximum withdrawal rate from a portfolio. He grabbed a bunch of data. He assumed that an investor's portfolio only included the S&P 500 and 5-year US T-bills, and they were invested 60% stocks, 40% bonds. So he grabbed a whole bunch of data, went all the way back to 1927 and said, if you're retiring in 1927 and you have a 30-year retirement window, what's the maximum percent that you can take out of your portfolio every single year, incorporating inflation, and never run out of money? And then he did the same analysis. He slid that window forward 1 year, starting in 1928. What's the maximum withdrawal rate for a 30-year retiree starting in 1928? And then he did the same thing for 29. You slid forward all the way up until the 60s when he ran out of data. Remember, this was written back in 1993. And in a lot of 30-year periods, given that portfolio, you were able to take out 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10% per year of the portfolio and get to the end of the 30 years and never run out of money. But the one rate that worked in every single scenario was 4%. And that's where the 4% rule comes from. So Hey, they've got $5 million, Joe and Mary do. What if we just applied the 4% rule and allowed them to spend 4% of 5 million or $200,000 per year, which is $16,667 per month? Why wouldn't that work? And the answer is, well, they need to spend a little bit more than that because of their lifestyle, but also the 4% doesn't incorporate taxes. It's assuming that the portfolio is only invested in the S&P 500 and 5-year US T-bills. Modern portfolios invest in far more things than that to reap the benefits of diversification and risk-adjusted return. And in all likelihood, you can take out more than 4% by doing some of these things wisely. Look at Joe and Mary. They've got $3 million of their $5 million in a tax-deferred 401k, which means that every time they take money out of that account, it's going to be added to their tax bill. So for that reason, and the others I just listed, the 4% rule is a helpful rule of thumb, but it's not terribly applicable in the real world. So here's what it looks like for Joe and Mary. I've taken all those assumptions, put them into our software here, and what we're looking at is a projection of their portfolio value year by year over the next 30 years until they hit age 95. Now, what we're assuming here is the program knows about Joe and Mary's spending. It knows about their tax situation. It knows what kinds of accounts their portfolio is in and when money is going to have to come out of those accounts, and so on and so forth. We also assumed that Joe's eligible for a Social Security benefit of $3,000 per month. Mary is not eligible for benefits based on her own earnings record, but can claim spousal benefits based on Joe's. Now, the big assumption here that is completely unrealistic in what we're looking at is that Joe and Mary's portfolio is going to grow by a little bit more than 7% every single year until they pass away at age 95. And that's not going to happen, right? The long-term average rate of return they might get on a balanced, diversified portfolio might be around 7 or 8% per year over that 30 years. But in any one year, it might never resemble 7 or 8%. In one year, you might get 12 or 15 or 20% because the market is good. The next year, the markets might crash. You might lose 20%, and the value of the portfolio falls from 5 million to 4 million before bouncing back. There's volatility and variations on a year-to-year basis. And so an improvement on this method of evaluation is what's called a Monte Carlo analysis. Our software here has about the last 100 years of market data at its disposal, and it knows the probability that things go up and down and sideways. And what we're instructing the program to do is run 1,000 trials, knowing the probabilities of Joe and Mary's portfolio going up and down and this, that, and the other, and spitting out in how many of those trials did they reach age 95 with money in the bank, and in how many of those trials did they run out. And what we're seeing here is that in this scenario, in 960 of those trials, with them spending $20,000 a month, they had plenty of money in the bank by the time they got to 95. And in only 40 of them did they ever run out of money. Now, this is a helpful method of evaluation, but it's far from perfect because we're making a bunch of assumptions and then telling the program that they're going to remain true over the entire course of the 30 years. And realistically, people change. The world changes. We make adjustments along the way. Joe and Mary, if they're like most people, probably don't want to spend $20,000 a month every year for the rest of their life and then die with $30 million in the bank. On the other hand, if they catch an unfortunate turn of circumstances and the value of their assets is going down, they might need to tighten the belt a little bit. And this screen assumes that none of those changes occur. So a couple of things I want to point out that are really very realistic that Joe and Mary will have to deal with is, number one, from a cash flow perspective. If we forecast where their expenses are going to be paid out of, they're working now, they're transitioning into retirement, they have $5 million in their nest egg to work with. The question is, okay, they're going to spend $20,000 a month, which includes the mortgage. Where's the money going to come from, right? They have $100,000 in the bank, but when and how are they going to take money out of the other retirement accounts? So this is a graphical representation of what this actually looks like for most people. The red line represents total expenses including taxes. And by the way, I live in California. I'm assuming that Joe and Mary do too, and therefore have to pay California income taxes. So this red line goes up a little bit with inflation over time, and then it goes up more drastically when Joe and Mary get into their mid 70s, and I'll explain that in just a minute. The columns represent where their expenses are going to be paid from. This yellow color means that they're going to have to take money out of their accounts, out of their investment accounts, to pay for these expenses. The dark blue represents Social Security. Remember, they're going to have $3,000 a month coming in from Social Security plus Mary's spousal benefit when they hit full retirement age of 67. With that money coming in, that simply means they have to take a little bit less out of their other accounts. Now, of their portfolio, Joe and Mary have $3 million in tax-deferred 401ks. And what we're assuming here is that in the early years, Joe and Mary are taking money out of their taxable investments first to pay living expenses, and they're allowing their tax-deferred and tax-exempt Roth accounts to continue growing, because mathematically that's usually what's best for people. But the government, the IRS, has been allowing you to defer and allowing Joe and Mary to defer taxation on that 401k for their whole life. They don't allow you to defer taxation forever and actually force you to start taking money out when you get into your mid-70s. And so whereas this yellow color represents discretionary withdrawals from their accounts, this orange column represents mandatory withdrawals from their accounts. So when Joe and Mary turn 75, they're going to have to start drawing from that 401k. And every year that they get older, they have to take a larger and larger portion of their accounts out, which is why these columns keep going up and up and up. And that's why this red line representing their expenses goes up and up and up. It's because their tax burden gets higher and higher and higher because they're forced to distribute a larger and larger portion of their account. So from one perspective, yeah, Joe and Mary want to spend $20,000 a month. They're probably going to be fine, right? They might have to make some adjustments along the way, but they'll have plenty of resources to be able to do that. That being said, if they're like most people and have a fair portion of their assets in tax-deferred accounts, they're going to be walking into a really major tax bill here in their 70s and 80s and 90s. And there are ways to mitigate that, either through qualified charitable distributions, Roth IRA conversions, and a couple other strategies that can really spread out that those tax ramifications and keep them into lower brackets. If we take a look at what that looks like, look at what their annual tax burden is going to be on a year-to-year basis. It's not going to be that high here in the early years because they have the trust that they can distribute money from and pay their taxes. And yeah, they might have some capital gains, but they're not paying income on every penny that comes. They're not paying income tax on every penny that comes out. But as soon as they get into their 70s, they will. And that's when it grows and grows and grows and grows and makes these strategies a lot more appealing. Now, realistically, they've got $5 million. Things are looking pretty good. How much can they spend, right? Well, one thing we want to consider is, long-term care is relevant for most people. Most of us at some point are going to need long-term care services. What if one of them needs to enter a long-term care facility in their mid-80s at the cost of $100,000 a year? That can be potentially costly. And if that occurs, that reduces the outcome by just a little bit, but still to a very palatable point. If we increase their spending by $5,000 a month, now we're starting to see a more drastic change. This level is not too dangerous, I would say. You can proceed with this chance of success without taking too much risk, as long as you're comfortable making adjustments along the way. And if you never need long-term care services, then that outcome improves drastically. When you go up from $20,000 to $30,000 a month in spending on a $5 million retirement portfolio, that's when things start to break a little bit. So I think my perspective here is that provided that Joe and Mary have a reasonably balanced and sound investment strategy and portfolio, and they can keep their expenses at $25,000 a month or less, at least in the early years, they're probably going to be fine. That being said, there is substantial opportunity here to do some tax planning and keep their living expenses, which include taxes, down to a more balanced level, because right now they're going to be a lot lower. And then once you get into your mandatory distribution phase down the road, that's when they're going to increase substantially thanks to those, again, those mandatory distributions. So those are observations. This is typically what we see more of when somebody comes in with a $5 million portfolio and is looking for help organizing everything in a way that makes the most sense for them. And as always, this should revolve around your family and your values and what you really want out of your retirement years and what you want and need to be happy and content. And for someone with these kinds of resources, that's very doable as long as it's done thoughtfully. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you like the video by touching the button on your screen below and let us know in the comments what we missed. There's a lot of planning considerations when you're transitioning into retirement. We kind of just scratched the surface today. There's all sorts of strategies and tax stuff and cash flow stuff you can do depending on your own circumstances. So let us know in the comments below what we missed.